Hello again. We're going to look at Cooper and John chapter 11, and we're going to discuss a very contentious and interesting economic anomaly called the minimum wage. Now, if you're American and you've spent enough time in the United States, then you probably know about a minimum wage, and most other Western countries have them also. So if you're anywhere from Europe or Canada, then you've heard of this concept. Going in this chapter to look at the difference between real minimum wage and nominal minimum wage. We're going to look at how we determine the equilibrium real wage and a normal level of employment, and then we're going to see what happens when the government imposes a minimum wage. We're also going to see what happens if there is inflation under a minimum wage. We're going to look at the efficiency costs of the minimum wage, and we're going to debate whether or not those are really there or not. All right, let's move forward, and just to kind of give us a sense of how it works in the United States, the Department of Labor makes every employer show a poster like this in a public place that all employees can see. And if you notice, it shows that right now the minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 per hour. Now, some states do have a higher minimum wage based on the cost of living in those states and based on what those legislatures wanted to do. But at the minimum, every worker in any state in the United States must be paid at least $7.25 an hour. For those of you who have waited tables or worked in a restaurant or some other job where tips are a normal part of employment, there is a separate minimum wage for those kinds of jobs, and it is usually a few dollars lower than the other minimum wage. And this is because it's assumed that workers will also be paid tips, and so employers are allowed to pay them less per hour. Now, just looking at a history of how the minimum wage has worked, the first minimum wage in the United States at the federal level, at the national level, was in 1938. Fair Labor Standards Act, passed in 1938, called for a minimum wage. Now, it was enacted so that workers who were actually working could be paid living wages. It was generally, however, only used for workers in what we call low-skilled or unskilled labor markets. Now, this is not as derogatory as it sounds. What it means is that workers in these markets do not need a special certification or special training necessarily to at least secure the job. Now, to understand how this has changed over time, as you can see, it was 25 cents per hour back in 1938. Right now, I know this chart only goes until 2010, but even currently it is $7.25 an hour in the United States. But if we want to look at what the effect on workers was for this federal minimum wage, and the first thing we have to look at is the difference between what we call a nominal wage and a real wage. Now, nominal and real are terms that are regularly used in economics. We've already come across them so far in the textbook, and they can be applied to a number of different concepts. A nominal wage is what we call the stated wage. It's what's actually on your contract or on the legislation or in your paycheck. It is the nominal wage, stated. Now, the difference between a nominal wage and a real wage is the effect of inflation. And if you recall, inflation is the price level increases that occur over time in an economy. Inflation means that your $1 buys less tomorrow than it could buy today because price levels are increasing. So whatever cost $1 today might cost $1.10 or $1.25 tomorrow. Thus, if we want to look at what the quote-unquote real wage is, we take the nominal wage, or that stated wage, and we divide it by the price level in the economy at that time. Now, if we're just talking about a federal minimum wage, it's the exact same calculation. Take the nominal minimum wage, which right now we know federally is a $7.25 an hour, and we divide it by the price level. Now, functionally, how do we even do that? Well, let me work through an example for you. In your book, it shows you a process by which you can change a nominal wage or a nominal anything into the real wage or a real anything. First, you have to find a deflator. Now, what on earth is a deflator? It's a price index. In the United States, the most commonly used price index is something called the Consumer Price Index, which evaluates a basket of goods that are normally purchased by the average American in any given year, and it looks at what the average price is at any one time. So if we say the basket of goods includes bread and milk and gasoline and some clothing and other groceries and toiletries and things like that, we see what their prices were in one year versus another year. Okay, that's a deflator. That's the consumer price index. Secondly, you have to select your base year. Your base year is just what is the year to which you will compare all other years. Normally, we pick the current year or the most recent year that we have data for. Now we want to take note, what is the price level or the CPI amount for your base year? The next step is take every other year you are analyzing. It could be 50 years worth of data, it could be 2 years worth of data, but for each year you've got, take the stated CPI price level in that year and divide it by the CPI price level in the base year. Now, if I took the CPI price level for 2014 and I divided it by the CPI price level for 2014, I would get 1. So you should get an answer of 1 when you do this calculation for your base year. Once you have this valuation, this is your deflator valuation, you will use it to divide all of the information, for instance, in this case, the nominal wage, in all of the subsequent years. Let's work through a real example so you can see how it goes. I went out on the internet and I went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and I found some price information. Now, I just picked a few different years. I started with the first year in which a minimum wage was enacted. I picked a middle year, and then I picked the year 2012. I decided that my base year is the year 2012. Now, I grabbed the CPI price level information for those years. In 1938, the CPI was 14.10. In 1968, it was 34.8. In 2012, my base year, it was 229.59. Now, I needed to find that valuation. I have to take each year's CPI price level and I have to divide it by the base year, okay? And I come up with these answers. For 1938, my price level indicator or my price level deflator will be 0.061. For 1968 is 0.152. And then for 2012, which is my base year, it is indeed 1. Now I take those deflators, or those divided indices, and I grabbed the nominal wage information. Nominal minimum wage in 1938 was $0.25. Nominal minimum wage federally in 1968 was $1.60, and in 2012 it's $7.25. I take those nominal minimum wages and I divide them by the valuation I got over here. And what I find is that in 2012 dollars, the minimum wage in 1938 would be $4.07. If that same wage, if that same level had been applied right now in 2012, it would have been $4.07, which is lower than it is in 2012, right? It was $7.25 in 2012. It still is today. So that means compared to the actual real minimum wage, 1938 had a lower real minimum wage than 2012. However, we notice that $1.60 paid to an individual in 1968 is actually worth $10.56 in 2012, which means the minimum wage in real terms in 1968 was far lower than the minimum wage we see right now in 2012, which is $7.25. Looking at that graphically, what we see is the difference between the real minimum wage in any given year and the nominal or stated minimum wage that does not take into account the effects of inflation throughout time. And we see that in the 1960s through the early 1970s, this period right here, the real minimum wage was much higher than it is right now. Now that's just an understanding of nominal versus real wages. Let's go back to the labor market and how it works. Remember in Chapter 9, we learned that the labor market is like any other competitive market, or at least it generally is, and that means prices are set where supply equals demand. In the competitive labor market, the price is actually what we call the wage, and that is going to be set where labor supply equals labor demand. Let's just take two examples. We say that labor supply in our particular labor market, for the purposes of our evaluation, the labor supply is calculated by 10,000 times the real wage. Now, in order for this market to be competitive, we have to say labor supply must equal labor demand, which means if labor demand equals 72,000 minus 8,000 times the real wage, we would take those two pieces and we put them together. Labor supply must equal labor demand, right? So 10,000 times the real wage must equal 72,000 times 72,000 minus 8,000 times the real wage. If we do a little bit of algebra, we find out that in this market, with these characteristics, the real wage is $4. Let's look at that graphically. The real wage comes out to be $4. And if I plug the term $4 back into either one of these equations, let's just plug it back into labor supply. If labor supply is 10,000 times the real wage, that means 40,000 hours is going to be the market equilibrium quantity of labor hours at the market equilibrium wage rate of $4. Now, I could do the exact same thing here. 8,000 times 4 is 32,000. 72,000 minus 32,000 is going to be $40,000. You notice this occurs where the labor supply curve crosses with the labor demand curve. Now, let's look at a base year. If I had been looking at any base year, it doesn't really matter what year it is, I want to look at what's the difference between the nominal wage and the real wage. Well, in the base year, since my deflator amount, my price level amount is just equal to 1 because it's the base year, then I would assume that labor supply, it's 10,000 times the real wage, and the real wage always equals nominal wage divided by the price level. Well, nominal wage divided by 1 is still just going to be the nominal wage. So what I find out is that the real wage equals the nominal wage in the base year. Now let's introduce some inflation. What if inflation is 10%? That means that the price level in the overall economy has increased by 10%. From the perspective of those who supply labor, and that's the workers, remember, workers make up the supply for labor. How do the workers feel about an inflation increase of 10%? Well, that means each of the dollars that they receive in their wages is worth less than it was. If the price level increases 10%, we're saying the price level went from 1 to 1.1. We're saying that the real wage, if it equals nominal wage divided by the price level, my real wage just went down. And because of the decrease in purchasing power, households will want to supply less labor, right? Because they're not getting as much from their wage, because it doesn't buy as much. They will want to decrease the supply of labor unless the nominal wage is raised to make up for their loss of purchasing power. Now let's look at this from the characteristics or from the perspective of those who demand labor, which are the firms. The firms see their prices increase 10%, which means they make more profit for each good they sell. That means for the same amount of labor, they are now seeing an increase in the value of their profit. This means firms may be willing to raise their nominal wage because they've got extra profit, which should keep the real wage the same. And remember, the workers were willing to keep supplying the same amount of labor as long as the nominal wage was raised. Well, firms have more profit. They could raise the nominal wage, and in general, in a competitive market, that's exactly what we would see. We would see the new nominal wage would increase 10% to $4.40. Now, in order to calculate the real wage, remember, a real wage is calculated by taking the nominal wage divided by the price level, and the price level is now 1.1 because we've seen a 10% increase. Well, if you do that calculation on a calculator, you'll discover 440 divided by 110 gives us $4. That means in a competitive market, a 10% increase in the price level in the economy will cause the real wage to stay the same and the quantity of labor supplied and demanded to stay the same because nominal wage will increase. Hopefully you can see that. Now that's a competitive market. Let's introduce some government intervention, and let's remind ourselves that the moment the government intervenes, we don't have a purely competitive market anymore. We now have an outside force acting on the market. Let's say the government decides to place a minimum wage requirement on all firms. Well, we just went from a market clearing or a market equilibrium wage rate of $4. Now it's going to be $5. Well, labor demand, which is how much labor the firms are willing to employ, at the new higher wage, they're willing to employ, look at this, fewer workers. But at that new higher wage, the amount of labor workers would like to supply is actually greater. Remember, our equilibrium used to be 40,000 hours of labor at $4. Now, the workers in the economy would like to supply 50,000 hours of labor, but the firms in the economy are only willing to employ 32,000 hours of labor. The amount of employment has fallen and unemployment has risen. And that's because the minimum wage does not equal the equilibrium wage. The demand for labor now does not equal the supply for labor. Now, in this case, the minimum wage was greater than the equilibrium wage, which means that the demand for labor is now less than the supply of labor in the market. Now, it's possible that the minimum wage could be set below the equilibrium wage, somewhere down in here, right? That would actually mean that the demand for labor would be greater than the supply for labor. Now, let's take the more likely situation, which is that the minimum wage is set at a rate that is higher than the equilibrium wage. The higher wage rate causes employers to demand less labor. The amount of labor or the amount of employment decreases. The higher wage rate also causes new workers to supply more labor, or at least they want to supply more labor. Workers who may previously not have been involved in that labor market, which means unemployment increases not only because employers laid off 8,000 hours worth of labor, but also because there was 10,000 hours of increased desire to supply labor. So unemployment is affected both by the increased desire of workers to work and the fact that the firms cut workers. Now, what happens if inflation occurs and we have a minimum wage situation? Well, this is interesting. Now, you may think we're just trying to make this complicated, but just follow along because it gets interesting. The minimum wage is a nominal wage. Remember, it's not a real wage. The law just says it's $7.25, not $7.25 worth of purchasing power, just $7.25 worth of dollars, regardless of how many products those dollars can purchase. What happens if inflation is 10%? Now remember, the way to calculate a real minimum wage is you take the nominal minimum wage. In this case, we had talked about a law where the nominal minimum wage was $5. The price level is now 1.1 because we have a 10% increase. If I do that division, I come up with that the new real minimum wage is not $5 now, it's $4.55. By inflation occurring in the economy at the tune of 10%, I effectively cause a decrease in the real wage. A decrease in the real wage means firms will see higher prices in the market and they may be willing to hire more workers. We could reduce unemployment. Let's look at this graphically. We went from having $5 wage rate to a real wage rate of $4.55. Whereas at a $5 real wage rate, firms were willing to hire 32,000 hours of work. Now they are willing to hire 35,600 hours of work. So we've just added 3,600 hours of labor demand. That means whereas previously at $5 unemployment was this big, unemployment is now smaller. To sum up, inflation lessens the employment impact of a minimum wage law. It lessens that decrease in employment, and it lowers the real wage, causing firms to usually decide to hire more workers. So, while we're more or less saying that minimum wage isn't necessarily the best idea for overall employment in the economy, and it's not the best idea for the overall unemployment, it seems that inflation, which wasn't necessarily our friend all the time, especially as consumers, it can be a friend to workers because it may cause a lower negative effect because of the minimum wage. Now, when we evaluate the minimum wage, economists like to look at efficiencies. Let's remember what market efficiencies even means. Remember that when there is trade happening in markets, what they allow for are gains from trade. And remember, gains from trade are the buyer's surplus plus the seller's surplus. In the labor market, the buyer's surplus is the profit that firms gain by hiring workers. In the labor market, the seller's surplus is the benefit workers gain by selling their labor. Efficiency occurs when the gains from trade are maximized. That means nobody can be made better off without somebody being made worse off. We've hit the point where gains from trade are maximized. That's a market operating in an efficient manner. Inefficiency occurs when the gains from trade cannot be maximized. Inefficiency is called a deadweight loss. If you've ever heard the term deadweight, you know that it seems that dead bodies are more difficult to move. They actually feel heavier than live bodies. Well, we use that term in economics also. Now, deadweight losses are bad enough, but there are other market inefficiencies that can occur because of a minimum wage, and one of the biggest ones is that it may create incentives for cheating, meaning that employers will try to get around the minimum wage if there are workers who are willing to work for less than the minimum wage, etc. Let's look at that deadweight loss, though. Let's look at it on a graph. In a nice, efficient market, the equilibrium wage will be set where labor supply equals labor demand. This amount is the surplus that firms see, and this amount is the surplus that workers see. Now we introduce a minimum wage. And what happens is the seller's surplus does go up, but the buyer's surplus decreases. And then we have, because we are employing at lower quantities, this whole purple area is deadweight loss. This is the loss of both seller surplus and buyer surplus. The market is no longer efficient, and we now have a loss in our economy. We have a lost surplus. For economists, this is a clear sign that minimum wage generally does not work. In our next video, we're going to look at, however, exactly what do economists mean when they talk about who wins and who loses in the minimum wage.